Welcome to the Hard Won Wisdom Podcast with best-selling author Fawn Germer and corporate innovator Michelle Brigman. Come here weekly for career and life-changing conversations with some of today's most influential thought leaders, senior executives, and trailblazers who will share their mentoring wisdom. This podcast is brought to you by the Women's Leadership Network.
Hi, I'm Fawn Germer.
And I'm Michelle Brigman.
And today we have a guest that I have been waiting for months because she is a super explorer, adventurer. She goes where none of us dared to go. And then now is bringing bold, courageous women along to do expeditions in places that are far away and really challenging. And I want to do it. So I want to hear more about it. Susan Eaton, welcome to the Hard Won Wisdom Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to meet both you and Michelle.
Well, it's really our honor. And if you can just dive right in, well, that's appropriate for you, but dive right in on how you became such an accomplished explorer and where that has taken you.
Yeah. I think I always was an explorer. As a child, I was curious about the world around me. I was fascinated by nature. And my mother was a marine biologist, so I had a really great role model as a woman, a professional biologist, and I got to go on field trips with her, flying over the Atlantic Ocean, spotting whales, dissecting whales that washed up on beaches, and looking at sea turtles and so on. So it was really exciting, and that role model, my mother, propelled me towards marine biology. And when I was 16, I thought, well, if Jacques Cousteau is going to hire me, I better become a scuba diver. My mother could barely swim and she was a marine biologist, but I was certified at 16 during a snowstorm in Halifax Harbor. I'm from the northeast coast of Canada. And it's a wonder I kept scuba diving because it was brutal 2 days of snowing in February, learning how to scuba dive. But I continued diving through my entire career.
You seriously learned to dive in that kind of cold water?
Really cold water, certification in February during a snowstorm, a weekend-long snowstorm. Yeah, it was pretty tough.
I want my pool to be 88 degrees before I even think about getting in.
That's for my time that I've spent in the Arctic and the Antarctic, right? So I was tough as a teenager, and I've continued to explore cold waters on the planet, from Antarctica to the Arctic and many places in between. But my love affair with the ocean, which was born out of scuba diving and my mom being a marine biologist, morphed 15 years ago when I had a dive trauma. I suffered a dive trauma. It wasn't an accident, but I ended up in a hyperbaric chamber for 3 days, and I emerged out of the chamber as a non-diver.
Okay, back up. So wait, what was this trauma? What actually happened?
Well, it's called an arterial gas embolism. And what that means is bubbles under pressure, because I was scuba diving and the gas contains a lot of nitrogen, moved from the venous to arterial chambers in my heart and throughout the arterial system in my body. And it was akin to almost having a stroke. I was transported to the chamber. The plane flew at half altitude to get me there. And, I'm lying in the chamber thinking, well, darn, there goes my story for the Calgary Herald on scuba diving with whale sharks during the full moon when the coral are spawning. And I was quite distraught about that. And within a day, I thought, well, maybe a story about a diver ending up in a hyperbaric chamber and coming out the other end intact is more interesting from a human perspective than the story about whale sharks, because anyone can dive with whale sharks. So I started writing about my experiences morphing from a scuba diver to a snorkeler. And I started seeking out really exotic places to snorkel around the planet, like snorkeling in Hudson Bay with thousands of beluga whales, which are really quite chatty and they're very interactive with snorkelers. Snorkeling on Vancouver Island with millions of migrating salmon. You're coming down the river and they're going up, and they divide when they see you because they think you're probably a seal. So snorkeling with salmon, and then snorkeling on the northern tip of Baffin Island in Canada's Nunavut territory with narwhals. And that's how it kind of evolved and down to Antarctica, being charged by leopard seals, which are the biggest predator apart from orcas in Antarctica, with their mouths gaping open, and you could count the freckles on their upper palates and on their tongues because their mouths were around your face mask, your scuba diving mask. So I've been really fortunate to dive and snorkel now around the planet, and the cold waters seem to draw me, despite the fact it's uncomfortable. We wear dry suits, and oftentimes the inner suit is heated, so it's not as tough as it looks. But there's a lot of action in both Antarctica and the Arctic, and they're both suffering in real time from the impacts of climate change. They're warming dramatically, and so these are hotspots when it comes to talking about climate change, and that's why I'm there.
Well, before we go into the climate change, I'm sitting here trying to process what you just said, and you kind of blew through it, quickly. But there's this moment where your whole life and identity has been centered around scuba diving.
Yes.
And you're in this chamber, and I bet there was a whole lot more to it than, it could be interesting. How did you come to grips with this identity change, the situation, and really boldly move into something else? Just as adventurous, but just that's a lot to take on. And there's a lot of people that have been hit with something in their life where the role they thought they were going to play, it doesn't look the same anymore. So I'd love more about that.
A great question, Michelle. And I was lucky to be alive, firstly. And secondly, I was really, I was disturbed that I was going to write the piece that I'd gone to write because I'm a freelance writer. Apart from being educated in marine biology and geology, I also have a journalism degree, and I write travel pieces, and I write for science magazines and so on. So I thought, well, darn, that story's gone. I don't have a story anymore. But as I described earlier, I realized that the human element here of what happened to me was probably more important than diving with whale sharks. But how do you deal with that? I was depressed for about a year after I came out of the chamber, thinking, well, my entire life has been scuba diving and traveling the planet, exploring the planet that way, and now I can't do that. So I was at a crossroads. I wasn't sure what to do, but I really was connected to the ocean, having grown up beside the ocean. And I discovered through reading that people could snorkel with beluga whales. I thought, well, that's fascinating. And then snorkel with migrating salmon. So I decided I would actually try the snorkeling bit, because when you're a scuba diver, the upper 5 meters of the water column, which is the snorkel zone, is something you get through really quickly. You want to get to deeper depths. You need to go down quickly. But from my perspective, it's the most exciting part of the ocean because it's bathed in sunlight. If you're taking photographs or videos of animals, you don't need to put a strobe on your camera system because it's got light. And all the air-breathing animals, including, marine iguanas, turtles, and all the mammals, they come to the snorkel zone to breathe. So it's the most exciting part of the ocean, quite frankly. And I didn't know that before.
It's so much more colorful. Right?
It's so much more colorful. But the other thing too is, as you go down to 60 or 90 feet, everything turns a green-gray because the light spectrum is absorbed. And so, yes, much more colorful. And I fell in love with the ocean all over again from a completely different perspective. And that's the perspective that I'm sharing with people around the world, and also with the women on the expeditions that I'm leading. Is we hang out in the snorkel zone a lot. Some of us dive. I obviously no longer dive, but in many cases, when there's charismatic megafauna, and by that I mean humpback whales or belugas or narwhals, big animals that are in the snorkel zone, you don't need to scuba dive to interact with them. And so I really do think it's the place to be. And I'll give you one analogy, which I think is a good one. I believe from my experience that snorkeling is to scuba diving what cross-country skiing is to downhill skiing.
Yeah, I was thinking about this because I used to be a downhill skier. I blew my knee out and I switched to cross country.
Exactly. So both the cross-country skiing and snorkeling are low footprint activities on the environment. You don't need a big dive boat, and you don't need a downhill resort. And when you're snorkeling or you're skiing cross country, you're pretty quiet.
Right.
And wildlife interactions happen because you become part of the ecosystem as opposed to forcing yourself on the downhill and in the scuba zone. So multi-generations of families can cross country ski together and snorkel together.
Yeah.
So I really do believe that it's a much more accessible way to explore the ocean than scuba diving is, as is cross country skiing to downhill.
And I think that is absolutely true. I was really relating to that when you're saying that. But honestly, it's that point Michelle made that, really says a lot about your character, which is that it really isn't about and I've been a diver since 1983. I mean, I like the snorkel zone. It's prettier. It's easier. It's just, I like it. But it's not about snorkeling and diving. It's about that ability to pivot when suddenly somebody takes your passion and you don't get it anymore. You can't do it anymore. And then
but you can redirect it. Yes.
Well, that's a great statement about who you are as a person. I like that.
Well, thank you so much. I think out of necessity comes these step changes in our lives, or these pivot points. And during the last 2 years of COVID, I think we've pivoted a lot, and we may not have understood the pivots we've made. And so I think with when one door closes, another one opens, the cliche, but I think it's really true. And being able to recognize that there is a door you can open is really important, because a door can be closed through no fault of your own. But sometimes that door, you have to create it too. Sometimes there may be a hint of it, a bit of light behind it, but you have to go towards it and open it and create what's on the other side, which is what I've done in the snorkel zone.
Yeah, Michelle, don't you think that's kind of inspiring how she just was so determined to carry on in a different way. And so as you do this with the snorkeling, are you free diving to them?
Not always. In our team, some women are free divers. I tend to be, we're in really cold water. So that's the issue when we're in the Arctic or Antarctica. We're wearing big, bulky dry suits.
And then how cold is it?
Salt water freezes at about minus 1.8 degrees Celsius. And if we're snorkeling and or diving in and around pack ice, it's minus 2 minus 2 degrees Celsius. So it is cold. It can be really cold. So that means it's difficult to free dive when you're wearing so much gear. And if you wanted to put a very large, heavy weight belt on, you could, but you might have a hard time getting back up. So we tend to be on the surface more so. And the kind of photography that our team does, which I love, is called split screen, half above the water, half below the water. And that's a really great transition for people who want to explore the ocean to see, maybe they're seeing land on the upper half or sky, and then they come right into the water and they see what's underwater. And so it gives them that introduction into the world of the ocean or rivers or lakes that is somewhat grounded in what we know already. But for a lot of people, they've never put their face underwater with a scuba diving mask on, even if they're snorkeling, which is it's really quite sad, because more than 70% of the planet's surface area is covered by ocean, and it's a really exciting place to hang out.
Oh yeah. Where in this journey that you've taken, where did the passion around just the changes you noticed with climate? Because was that something you were interested in when you got started, or was it as you were out exploring, you noticed something that sparked a passion within you?
Well, I've always been concerned about conservation of animals and ecosystems. But when I started scuba diving, the Caribbean was fairly pristine. It was. And so in the 40 years or so from the time I started diving in the Caribbean to today, I've seen extremely significant changes, and not for the better. And so, for those of us who I started diving in the mid 70s, and seeing a reef today and knowing what one looked like in 1976 or 77, it's kind of disturbing. And when I dive with people who've never been to the Caribbean before and they're just so excited about it, I don't want to say, well, you know what it looked like 40 years ago. This is nothing in comparison. because I want them to enjoy what they're discovering. But maybe the conversation later is, hey, things are changing and not for the better. What can we do as divers and snorkelers and people who explore the ocean to introduce it to other people, engage with them, inspire them to take some action steps to protect the planet? So the climate change discussion has really only taken hold since the 1990s. I think in the last 20 years, we'd all agree that everyone is talking about it. And every decade it seems to have gotten more dire in terms of what we're facing. So I think it's probably the biggest issue we're dealing with on the planet, and conservation issues are tied to climate change, because if you're going to protect an area today, is it really the right area to protect, knowing that the warming trend that's happening, maybe the animals don't need to be protected in the valleys today. You need to protect up to 1,000 meters above the valley floor, because they're going to move up the valley wall to get to cooler temperatures. So really, conservation and climate change are completely interconnected today, whereas before it was more conservation, and climate change was something we really couldn't quantify 20 or 30 years ago. But I think that the general public has a very good understanding of what's going on today.
Are you driven by the science, by the going where other people don't go? So is it the experience being out there, or is it that it awakens something within you? And if so, if that's it, what is it bringing out in you? And is that what's happening to the women that travel with you?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I belong to many learned societies that are exploration societies, and women are really in the minority in these societies. It's changing through time, but still in the minority. And the historical idea of an explorer is male, someone who goes where no man's gone before, someone who's the first to the top of a mountain, the first to the moon, or the first to the bottom of the Marianas Trench. And when that was happening in the 1700s, I mean, even from Christopher Columbus upwards, right, to today, it was first to put the flag on the South Pole, first to put the flag on the North Pole, and so on. And that was at the time deemed to be important for, actually, it was very geopolitical. Who's going to claim the North Pole? Who's going to claim the South Pole? But today, because we're facing so many issues, we're talking about human rights issues, gender issues, climate issues, and so on, and they're all really interconnected. The old-fashioned idea of an explorer being the first person to do something, for me, is not that important, really. And that's a male construct. It's sort of a colonial construct, from Europe, that moved over to Canada and the United States because we were founded by the British. And I think that women today are finding their way as explorers, and they're doing it differently. And from my perspective, when I go to the Arctic and we work in Indigenous communities with Inuit women and girls, and also with the boys, climate change has a human face in the Arctic. And that human face is the Indigenous people. And it's happening in real time for them. And because it's happening in real time for them, I'm very focused on understanding how they're dealing with it, understanding their traditional knowledge, which is a really big database for us to combine with conventional science or Western science, and see what we can do to work together to collaborate on solutions or mitigation strategies. So everyone thinks of climate change in the Arctic as polar bears. And of course, they're really iconic. But the people in the Arctic who've lived there for millennia, 25,000 years, they're suffering too. And their traditional lifestyle has suffered greatly because of disappearing sea ice. So I think modern day explorers are not, at least from my perspective, and the women who are working in my teams, we're interested in understanding a place through the eyes of the people who live there. We're interested in learning the history, the geography, how they use the natural resources, their culture, and the issues that they're facing through grassroots collaboration as part of our expedition and exploration process. Because without it, I think we're working in a vacuum. And so therefore, I do reject the colonial aspirations of explorers that you have to be the first to plant a flag. Because in today's world, I think we're past that. Although, obviously lots of people would travel to Mars if they could, to be the first on the planet. And it might take them 10 years to get there. And that's pretty exciting, quite frankly. But my time on Earth, I think, is best suited to work with people and to engage women and girls so that they're at the table when decisions are being made on how to deal with climate change in the Arctic, Antarctica, and in their communities. So I think I started out thinking when I joined the Geographical Societies that that's what an explorer was. And I soon realized, well, that's probably not that important because the issues are so great today that we're dealing with. An explorer has to be a humanist, and an explorer has to be someone who is not only traveling to far places, but coming home with the information, the ideas, and the stories to inspire others to care about these places that they'll never get to travel to.
Well, that raises, I was sitting here thinking about, right, you're tackling very big, overwhelming objectives when you start talking about climate change and conservation. And as, the everyday person, the audience listening to the podcast, you care about it and, you recycle. We do little things at home. But I want to talk about, how do you influence the right decision makers to do something different on a large scale? Because again, if I relate this to business and our listeners, they've got something, it's important, but it may not be the number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 thing. So how do you go about influencing around these big ideas?
I think we start by leading by example. And so we're actually spending time, money, and effort to go to these very remote places. Our teams include scientists and artists and educators, Indigenous women and non-Indigenous women. And I think we're leading by example in showing that collaboration between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities is the most powerful way to influence outcomes. Because, a group of scientists coming from the South to the North who've never been there, and if they don't talk to the Inuit and the other Indigenous organizations and peoples up there, they're missing the mark. So I think we're leading in terms of showing that collaboration makes us more powerful in terms of our outcomes. We're leading by showing that teams of women, are equally capable, if not more capable, of doing these things. And we're inspiring younger women and women, who are post-career to get involved. So our teams have, to this point, we've run 4 expeditions since 2014, included women from age 16 to 78. And we're leading in terms of having multi-dimensional teams with respect to multi-generations, women from the North and South, Indigenous women, non-Indigenous women, artists who are equally as important as the scientists because they can use their various media to engage people in the discussion of climate change and ocean change, educators, because we're working on the ground with children in the Arctic as well as children in the South. We spend a lot of time in classrooms. We speak to children remotely and in person. So how do we do it? Well, it takes a lot of time and commitment, and we've just hit our 10th year here, and 10 years still exploring, and we're getting ready for maybe another 10. It's kind of exciting. So it's a ripple effect. I think the fact that all these women come together on expeditions, we work leading up to the expeditions, during and post expeditions. Our science is being published by scientists. We have a big program in Norway in November 2022 that's been delayed 2 years by COVID, but we're finally going. And our scientific studies will be published from the 2022 expedition. I think it's the ripple effect and the empowerment of women of all generations. We have women who have raised families and are now on our expedition, and they're calling themselves explorers. So they're not what a conventional explorer might look like if you were reading stories about explorers from the 1800s or 1900s even. So we're giving women opportunities to participate in climate science, to participate in community collaboration in northern communities. And they go home and they tell their families, they speak publicly at community halls, they have partners and sponsors. And so I call it the ripple effect. And that's what we hope we're affecting with a movement of women who call themselves explorers. And they come from all walks of life, all ages.
It sounds like the bigger element is something that I saw in your bio, and I wondered about, because you described yourself as a journalist, and my background is in journalism, and I think that's probably the smartest description of you of all, is that it's you go do all this work, and if you can't tell people about it, then you don't achieve any of your other goals. And that
Absolutely.
whether it is doing that through writing or speaking or through art or anything else, it's like that's the story is the biggest thing. When you've gone to all these places, what are the most faraway places that you've gone, and what are the moments that have physically taken your breath away, where you're like, oh my God?
I think we've gone to the Northwest Passage in the northeastern part of Canada in Nunavut. We've been up the Greenland coast, western Greenland coast, been to Iceland. We've been to the Labrador coast, which the Inuit territory there is called Nunatsiavut. We've been to northern Norway, to the Arctic fjords in Norway at 70 degrees north during the winter. What's taken my breath away has been the camaraderie of the team of women in our projects. And we're all volunteer based, by the way. Sea Women Expeditions has no full-time employees, none. The women actually, I invite them to participate because they have a skill set that can contribute to the outcomes of the expedition and oftentimes shape the expedition. And so the women are working on the projects together, and it's a collective effort in that women who may not have led before in the field because they're not getting that opportunity at their universities or their companies are getting leadership roles in our teams. So in our expedition, seeing young women lead segments of the expedition is pretty exciting. And seeing women who've never done anything like this before lead as well is equally exciting. And then the combination of Indigenous and non-Indigenous women in our team is powerful because we talk about women's issues. We run women's leadership programs now. And the issues that you and I would face in Canada and the United States, the gender-based issues, exist in the Arctic, but they're different. There's a different element to them, in some cases, different cultural elements. And so we're learning from each other. And I think that the most exciting part is the learning, the camaraderie, the learning, and sort of the ripple effect of what are we going to do next. Some of the young women in our team have gone on to do PhDs, and they've said, well, the field experience I got leading the science program helped me get into Stanford. That's really exciting to hear, or they've gone on to become expedition guides because of the time they spent on our expeditions as well. So I think that's it. And the warm welcomes that we've received from the communities in the North, in the Arctic, have been unparalleled. One story I'll tell you about in Iqaluit, which is the capital of Nunavut in Northern Canada, we run robot
It's the capital of what?
Nunavut. The territory of Nunavut is bigger than all of Europe. There's 39,000 people in it. And it's the eastern part of Canada, which is now the territory of the Inuit Nunavut.
That means it's really cold is what
That's right.
It can be. But in summer 2016, we were there and we were running a mobile aquarium program for the children, and our scientific divers went out and collected, invertebrate animals and fish, things like that, put them in the tanks. We turned them into touch tanks, and the kids could reach in and look at the animals, and we'd ask them, what's the Inuktitut word for this animal? Do you know the word? Are there any Inuit legends attached to these animals? So it was really a two-way educational process. It wasn't simply our marine biologists teaching these kids or their parents or the elders. We learned far more from them than they learned from us. And we learned to listen and give them that space to speak their truth and to talk about their view of the Arctic, because we're visitors. And so we felt as visitors, we tried to listen more than we spoke. We took our cue from our Inuit leaders and advisors in our team, and we had an amazing collaboration. We also ran underwater robot camps for kids, and PVC pipe, little motors, propellers, video cameras on them. Kids assemble them, put flotation devices on them, and go fly them in the ocean. And if they didn't fly, they'd bring them back, tear them apart, and rebuild them. We didn't really need to give much instruction because the children were really great at it. But we went with 8 robots, which we were going to donate to the community afterwards so that the learning could continue. But after the first day, we only had parts for 5 left because they were kids were knocking them on rocks, and we were losing pieces. And we thought, well, we've only got 5 for day 2 now. We started
That was an
with 8.
expensive Lego set you had there.
It was. But the most exciting part was that the next morning, when we were ready to do it again, keep in mind the tides are 12 to 14 meters here, almost 45 feet. The little girls who'd been there the day before went out on the tidal flats, and they picked up all the pieces that got knocked off the robots and brought them back to us. So suddenly we had 8 robots again. So they were really keen on doing it the second day. So they were very engaged. And to me, that's a really great success story, that
Yes.
the children, including the girls, were so excited that they went and scavenged for all the pieces that we lost, and we were ready to go again the next day. So there's been so many moments like that.
Well, did you find that, particularly in this Indigenous environment with the people there, that they were comfortable with girls assuming these new roles, or were you challenging sort of the norms and what was expected?
Well, that's a really good question, because the young women told us that they wanted to assume these new roles, that even in their culture, which is fairly traditional, women don't often hunt. Some women are very good, but traditionally the men hunt. And so for the women to learn how to snorkel and scuba dive and be part of this expedition, all women expedition, to them was really important to gain these skills that they traditionally would not be offered. And so we come to town, if you will, with the equipment, with the experts, and we ran that summer a mentorship program for 10 Inuit and Northern girls. We taught them how to snorkel. Actually, we taught, they were part of the robot and aquarium program, and each one of them had a mentor and mentor-mentee relationship. And 2 of those young women went on to learn how to scuba dive. 2 years later, they were part of our team in 2018. We went back to Nunavut and to Greenland. So, it was really, really exciting to see the progression of the young women's skills. And they may never become professional scuba divers or dive instructor, but they have the experience to see beneath the waves in their own territory, which very few people get to do. And I think that, we were breaking some barriers, I think, to what traditionally women do. The fact that we had all women in the team, and we had a woman Inuit advisor as well, quite remarkable woman in her own right, that, it worked. And so, yes, there's no real opportunity to actually get under the ice and snorkel or scuba dive in the Arctic. So we brought it to the youth. So that was pretty exciting.
When you look back on all of your years, and you've gotten a lot of recognition for that, and I hope you share a little of that, but what are the moments that were actually dangerous? And then how did you put your fears in check so that you could courageously go or where you needed to go?
I think my favorite moments have been when, after organizing an expedition for 2 or 3 years, it comes together and we're finally on the expedition ship and we're doing what we set out to do, and everyone's having a great time. I think that as an expedition leader, it's very much like being the CEO of a company or a team leader. You create a work environment where your team can flourish. And
But I'm saying, were there times when you're in danger? Not about your expedition, but you as an explorer individually, may have been when you were diving.
I would say during our expeditions with the women, no, we were never in danger. We were actually doing what might be deemed to be somewhat dangerous things, but we always had a really great dive outfitter who were expert in that area. So we always relied on a dive and snorkel company that would, do all the in-water safety, and they had local knowledge.
But what about you?
Pardon me, without me.
Yeah, no, on your own.
Oh, yeah. Well, I've been in some cases where I've been in really bad storms, crossing from Antarctica back to Ushuaia, where the waves were 100 feet tall and the boat was 70 feet long. Well, actually, let me recharacterize that. I've been in a force 11 storm, and force 12 is a hurricane, and the boat was 70 meters long, and the waves were 15 meters high, and they were breaking over the bridge, which is where the captain, and the crew are steering the ship. Really rough sailings, very scary, waves breaking the glass on the bridge where the captain and the crew are sailing the ship, and 100 kilometer an hour winds, like really bad storms in the Southern Ocean. On one particular occasion, I was not the expedition leader on the northern tip of Baffin Island. We were camped in a safari camp because we were snorkeling with narwhals on the floe edge, and our piece of ice broke away from land, and we floated 19 kilometers in open water towards the Northwest Passage. And we were involved in the biggest air evacuation, a search and rescue operation in Canada's Arctic history. And
Okay,
there was,
hear more on
I don't
that
know,
one.
four Hercules aircraft, 2 Twin Otter aircraft, 2 Cormorant helicopters, and 2 Griffin helicopters involved in getting us off the floating ice island, as I called it. It was quite shocking that it happened, but in hindsight, perhaps not. But the day before I left for the Arctic to camp on this sort of a safari camp on the ice, I called my insurance company and I said, in the hypothetical case that the ice that I'm camping on, which is holding fast to land, breaks away and floats towards the Northwest Passage, is my air evacuation insurance covered? And they said, absolutely. And I said, okay. And that's
totally
exactly what
jinxed it.
happened.
Oh my goodness.
And we had to disassemble our camp. The tour operator called search and rescue. It took 7 hours for the first Hercules to arrive from Ontario. And they dropped sort of parachutes with life rafts and satellite radios. We didn't have any life rafts on the ice. We had a couple of open kayaks, which were not suitable to evacuate people from. And so, yeah, I was involved in this big search and rescue effort, and it was very interesting, quite frightening. We ended up on shore when the ice smashed into the northern part of Baffin Island, and the Hercules overhead told us to get off the ice, that it was breaking up. They could see the cracks in the ice island itself. So yeah, that was touch and go.
Wait,
and,
so is that when you got into the rafts, or what did you do?
We didn't have to get into the rafts. Luckily, we actually were able to scramble over the ice that was piling up on the end onto land. And then we got our luggage out, and they left most of the tents on the ice. And by the time they came back to get them, polar bears were eating the seats off the snowmobiles and so on. So, we were in polar bear territory too. So that was pretty exciting. And what it taught me, though,
great.
What it taught
how
me
hard
was,
it was for you to get this story out of her, and then it's like total.
I know, it's like
chaos.
It taught me that you go with the best outfitter, you go with the best team, and then when things are tough, you actually pull together and you help each other and you sort it out. And so that's what happened. And the next year I was leading a team of women on a boat up to Baffin Island and to Greenland, and people were saying to me, have you learned your lesson? And I said, yeah, the lesson is you go with the best outfitter, the best local experience, and you have plan A, B, and C. You always have plan A, B, and C. And because things in the Arctic are very fluid and unpredictable. So yes, I've been in a few tough situations, and staying calm is really important. I think that is the most important thing, staying calm. Yeah.
Did your life flash in front of your eyes?
Not then. I actually had another experience at Cocos Island where my life flashed in front of my eyes, but that was scuba diving with thousands of hammerhead sharks. But
let's hear that one.
Well,
Thousands.
Thousands.
Thousands. I was diving with a group of people. It was probably about 12 of us. And there was a fairly novice diver in the group, and I was going to be his buddy for the day, and we were going down something called Pinnacle Rock. The Zodiacs dropped us off, and in fact, it was a volcanic spire from the seafloor up, and you hand over hand going down Pinnacle Rock because of the currents to get to the bottom where it was a lot calmer. But he let go of Pinnacle Rock. And so I saw my buddy go flying, and I thought, man, I don't want to do this, but I let go too. And I went with him, and we were in shark infested waters, and no one knew where we were. We inflated our BCDs on surface, and he was a lot taller than me. His legs were longer, and he kept saying, they'll get me first. I said, yeah, but there'll be a feeding frenzy and they'll get me at the same time too. So that's not comforting. But so we basically talked to each other for 4 hours. We were floating around Cocos Island in the longshore current, and I was worried that the current would turn and go out to sea, because I thought as long as we're floating around the island in a certain direction, they'll probably find us. But if we get swept out to sea, the current changes direction, we're not going to be easily found. So we inflated our BCDs. We're on the surface talking to each other, not looking down too much. And eventually they did find us, but they cut the engines of the Zodiac. And the waves were probably about 1 meter in height, which means 3 feet. And they cut the engine of the Zodiac before they got to us. And my hand was in the air, and they grabbed it without telling me they were coming. And I had a bit of a meltdown at that point, because it was just
you didn't know what was grabbing you.
It was a pretty precarious situation. And so that was probably the most scary time diving, and hoping that they're going to find us. Now, we could have maybe gone to shore, but the island has no beaches, and there's just huge volcanic cliffs everywhere with waves crashing into them. So going to shore wasn't an option. Otherwise, we probably would have maybe gone. But so we were just floating and waiting in shark-infested waters. So it was a scary time. But again, we stayed calm and told each other jokes and waited, and didn't splash around because of the sharks. Yeah.
Now, how often are hammerheads aggressive?
Solitary ones are much more aggressive than the large numbers at Cocos Island are there. They're feeding and they're mating. So a solitary hammerhead in the Caribbean would probably be much more frightening than the schools of hammerheads at Cocos Island, for sure. But even so, when you look down, when you're diving and you suddenly see, I don't know, several hundred above you, and then several hundred at the same depth as you, and several hundred beneath you, it's a bit scary. It just takes getting used to, I guess. But it's the first time you see it, you realize, well, those are hammerheads, and there's a lot of them. Mm-hmm.
And so were they looking at you?
Yes, they would swim by and look at you with one eye. Yes, they would come by very close. Yeah,
that was
the scary thing. And as I was, getting out of the water into the Zodiac, and you don't want to be kicking your fins and splashing, I would just say, just grab me by whatever part you can find and just haul me in, because I'm not going to be flailing about here trying to get into the Zodiac. Yeah, but it was a pretty incredible expedition. And there was about 6 different types of sharks. The hammerheads were the largest, but there were quite a few other types of species of sharks there. Yeah.
Boy, you're way braver than I am.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Michelle's got to do the wrap, and we'll continue with this on our after show. What a great
But before I do the wrap, one question for you. So, Susan, you are doing amazing things just for the world, for women.
Yeah.
How do people stay connected with you, and how can they support you?
Well, we're on many social media channels as Sea Women Expeditions. They can find us there. And we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram and LinkedIn. And, we're going to be running expeditions, women-only expeditions to the high Arctic in the next couple of years. We're always looking for women to join our team. As I said earlier, we have a very diverse group of women, so you don't have to be a classical explorer to join our team. But yeah, if they just look for Sea Women Expeditions, they'll find us. And, we're just rebuilding our website because we rebranded. After 10 years, we've changed our name to reflect the fact that we're becoming much more circumpolar. We're not just exploring Canada, we're exploring the entire Arctic region. We hope to go to Russia someday with the recent
not this week,
turn of
right?
events. That's probably not going to happen for a while. And we may go to Antarctica too as a team. But I think that, Sea Women Expeditions, and at this point in time, we don't have any calls for support, whether it's a financial support or whatever, but oftentimes we run GoFundMe campaigns to pay for training for the women, to pay for the women's leadership program, and so on. So there'll definitely be some GoFundMe campaigns launching in the next couple months to support the women's leadership program, some of our team members, as well as training. We need to get some training to go to Norway. So that's all underway.
Great. Thank you. Well, so some great takeaways. I think some of my favorite, just a reminder, you're in these high risk situations, but we as businesswomen, business folks, we are dealing with change, volatility. And I think the lesson that you gave of always have a plan A, B, and C. If you're prepared and you think ahead, then you're going to be positioned much better in order to be able to pivot and handle that change. So just always think about what could possibly happen, because I think a lot of people don't take time for that. I also just very inspired by the fact that sometimes life throws you a big punch in the gut. And the fact that you don't have to give up on your passions and to really lean into and figure out new ways to explore the things you love, because that's still available to you. And I just think that was a gift that you gave our audience. But the most important takeaway for me is when you're swimming with 1,000 hammerhead sharks, don't splash.
Right. Absolutely. Don't splash.
This was awesome. Thank you for all you're doing, Susan. Just wow. Wow.
Susan, I really loved your stories. And
thank you.
Really grateful that Julie Commenda hooked us up, because really I admire what you're doing and am excited that you're on our show. And thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure, ladies, and thank you so much for your insightful questions.
Thank you for joining the Hard Won Wisdom podcast with best-selling author Von Germer and corporate innovator Michelle Brigman. Join us weekly for career and life-changing conversations with some of today's most influential thought leaders, senior executives, and trailblazers who will share their mentoring wisdom. This podcast is brought to you by the Women's Leadership Network. Visit hardwonwisdom.com for more on this podcast and for links to Fawn and Michelle's web pages and social media. Also, be sure to rate, subscribe, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We really appreciate that effort, and we'll see you next week.